Right now, and then. That's happening.
Councilman Adamson is on Zoom.
Hi, Josh. How are you?
I'm
Oh, there
good.
Thank you.
Just gonna,
Councilor Cal is unavailable today.
Counselor Braun has 1 minute. Yeah, 1 minute. He's pushing the, well, he's being Chris today. 1 minute. He's being Chris today, 1 minute. I'm waiting for Peter. Huh? I'm waiting for Peter. Yeah. I'm giving him 20 seconds. I'm giving Peter 20 seconds. I'll call the meeting to order. Do you have the roll call, June? All right. This is a work session of the council and the public is invited to attend and or view the meeting on Zoom. This is a discussion on the FEMA regulations, pre-implementation compliance measure discussion. You're on, Dana.
Thank you. And Andrea, if you could pull up the presentation. I've got a PowerPoint just so you can follow along, but I'll be just kind of blabbing. So anyway, first of all, I just want to say thank you everyone for coming both in person and on Zoom. I think this is a really big change and we're going to do our best to provide information to you today about our choices that are coming up really quickly on December 1st. So as the mayor mentioned, I'll be speaking about the FEMA biological opinion pre-implementation compliance measures. This presentation is available on the city's website. On the planning department page, we did create a FEMA floodplain development regulations page, which if anyone got the notice, that's the QR code. So you can scan that and get right to the page with the presentation if you want to look at this afterwards. I've also included some links at the conclusion of the presentation that you can use to view any of the maps that are shown in this presentation today. Also, before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that FEMA is requiring these changes and mandating that cities comply. We don't necessarily have a choice here, and I'll go into that in just a minute. And we also don't fully agree with the manner in which this is happening. It's been incredibly rapid. And it hasn't allowed for a lot of time for the public to really understand the implications of this. In general, I'm just going to say that the changes are onerous and going to complicate development in the floodplain and just make development, which is already pretty challenging, even more challenging. We'll take questions at the conclusion of this. If there are any questions we can't answer, we can relay those to city or state officials. FEMA has a pre-implementation compliance measure, which we're calling PICMs. They have a mailbox that we can send any questions to. It does take 1 to 2 weeks to get a response, so we may not have them by our next meeting, but we're happy to post any responses to those questions on the city's website. Next slide. So I'll just be going through today background on kind of how we got here, showing some maps of the affected areas in Bandon, providing an overview of the changes as well as some of the challenges that come along with those. And then a recommendation and next steps. Next slide. Okay. So FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's part of the federal government. They're tasked with responding to disasters and providing support to state and local governments when we are unable to. So in times of disaster, FEMA usually steps in. One of the programs that they offer is what's called the National Flood Insurance Program, which provides federally backed insurance for all structures with flooding risk. Those can be both to structures within the floodplain and outside of it. The city of Bandon is considered the floodplain administrator for that NFIP National Flood Insurance Program. And so we are required to adopt a regulating ordinance that meets or exceeds those FEMA guidelines. And they call this voluntary compliance. So essentially, in exchange for them providing this opportunity to have floodplain insurance, we choose to voluntarily comply with their regulations. So flood insurance is required for any property using federal financial assistance, which includes, to my understanding, all mortgages. So any mortgage-backed property in our floodplain does require flood insurance. Otherwise, it's optional. And so you can imagine, we'll go through the pictures, but there are a lot of properties that benefit from the city participating in and meeting the minimum standards of this National Flood Insurance Program. And we have had a floodplain chapter for a long time. We've regulated the floodplain for a long time. Our last ordinance was 2018. That was our last mandatory update. And the city has been following along with these changes, which began in 2009 when FEMA was sued by the Portland Audubon Society with a claim that FEMA was violating what's called Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act for failure to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service on the impacts of development on salmon and steelhead species, which are listed as threatened and endangered under what's called the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA. So as part of that, FEMA was required to prepare a biological opinion, which we call the BIOP. So just giving you some of this terminology. That BIOP found that the NFIP in Oregon reduced the quantity and quality of floodplain habitat, which was found to jeopardize the continued existence of 17 endangered marine species. So this is the origin of everything that we're talking about today, is this lawsuit that happened almost 15 years ago, and the response to that. In particular, the BIOP stated that there were impacts to flood storage, water quality, and riparian habitat. So those are the 3 items that are covered most in the changes that we're going to be looking at. As part of the BIOP, the entity that prepared it was required to provide what was called the reasonable and prudent alternative, which is sort of just, it's an alternative to what we're doing now. They gave some ideas for how we could amend our ordinances. Those were mostly around requiring that future development be limited in the most high risk and high value habitat areas, and that development requiring mitigation be tracked more closely. So before we hop into the changes, I just want to show you some maps so you're all aware of where in town people are affected. So if you can go to the next slide. Okay, and you'll notice that most of these changes affect Old Town, the Jetty, Johnson Creek, and some of the residential areas around Ferry Creek. So this is North Bandon. This would be along Riverside. You can see some of the Moore Mill site is affected. And some of the properties, so we did send out a notice to everyone who is affected by the floodplain. Some of the properties that are affected just have a little small bit. So if you want to look at and see where your property falls, we'll give you the link to that map at the end of this presentation. Okay, so next slide. This one is the big one. It's Old Town. So it's a little bit hard to see, but pretty much all of Old Town and even the Ferry Creek area, some of that woolen mill is affected by the floodplain. Everything along our waterfront, and then over onto Jetty Road. If you can go to the next slide, that one just covers that sort of South Ohio area. So you can see, let's see if that's helpful. So the furthest street to the right would be South Ohio. So it goes just along that whole Ferry Creek drainage. And then next slide. The jetty, pretty much all of the jetty is covered with floodplain. And in particular, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but it has what's called a velocity zone. So the VE area is going to be treated differently. Next slide. And then some of Beach Loop Drive. So we did send notices out to these property owners. I have met with a few people along Beach Loop Drive where it's really just a portion of their property that abuts the ocean that is affected by it. If you're not developing in that area, then you're not really affected by these changes. Again, most of those are like on a bluff where someone wouldn't be developing anyway, but you can see it just kind of hugs that corner. And then one more slide, Johnson Creek. And the majority of the city's Johnson Creek property is in the floodplain. There is a small area that we call Hoops Landing that's up above that is outside of it, but otherwise mostly floodplain. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I will go into what is changing and then we'll just talk a little bit about the challenges. So cities are required to modify their regulating ordinances to avoid adverse impacts on floodplain function and ensure this, what we're calling the no net loss standard. So there isn't allowed to be any sort of loss to critical habitats to these ESA species. While we were initially not scheduled to make these changes until 2027, as I mentioned, we've sort of been following this buy-up thing. FEMA was sued again, which prompted this requirement for pre-implementation compliance measures. So FEMA is currently doing an environmental impact statement. While that is being worked out, they're requiring that cities and counties adopt an interim measure to make sure that we're not further affecting these endangered species. We are allowed to choose between three great options. There's sarcasm there. A model ordinance, which we'll talk about, prohibiting all development within the special flood hazard area, which we're calling a moratorium, or taking what's called a permit by permit approach. It's a little bit less one size fits all. It's still not great, but we'll talk about what that one looks like. We do have to take action by December 1st. If we do not take action by December 1st, we default into what that permit by permit scenario. We have our meeting scheduled for December 2nd, so we will just be defaulting for that period of time. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, things are changing rapidly. We were notified in July that we were required to select one of these options. Between then and now, things have changed a lot. And so I'll just give you an example of, they issued a habitat assessment sample document that was 50 pages long. At the very beginning of this process, a couple weeks ago, they issued one that was 4 pages long. So the requirements are just constantly changing for cities. And one of the biggest issues for us and other small coastal communities is just a lack of resources. So keep that in mind as we're sort of going through these and picking the right approach for Bandon. And also keep in mind that what we're sharing with you today may be different tomorrow. So, I mean, I want to give you the information that I have while also being really clear that things are still changing. In general, I'll point out too that vacant land is going to be much more challenging to develop after December 1st. The existing buildings will have an easier time of sort of retrofitting if you wanted to redevelop or slightly expand a footprint, because you'll see in a little bit the way that the mitigation factors work. It's possible, but vacant properties are going to have a lot harder, a lot bigger barrier to go through. There may be some other long-term solutions. So as I said, this is interim. So we'll be doing this until 2027. They're still working on what those long-term solutions are. So there may be other options after 2027 to make things easier. My guess is that that's not going to happen, but we just don't know yet. And the other thing that's come up, we've been attending quite a few workshops. Oregon's clear and objective standard criteria is probably going to be one of the most challenging components of implementing this, because the model ordinance is not clear and objective yet. So just something to think about that we are working on and working with other cities and counties to determine how do we make a clear and objective process. Okay. So model code. So the model code was provided to cities just a couple of months ago. We were notified that they are changing that model code again, but it won't be available until December. So just know that if you choose the model code route, it will already be different by the time we're required to adopt it. It is a fits all approach. So it's very regulatory in the sense that if you remove one tree that's greater than 6 inches DBH, then you're required to provide at least 2 or 3 trees in its place, depending on which zone you're in. So it's standardized. It was developed by FEMA Region 10 in partnership with the DLCD floodplain coordinator. However, that coordinator did not pass on those clear and objective standards. So I will also say that this code is not clear and objective right now. This chapter or the changes here would affect all new development and redevelopment as well as vegetation removal, again requiring that no net loss standard. New development will require mitigation. So as I mentioned, the tree example, there's other examples of stormwater management or using different impervious surfaces to get to the no net loss standard. But essentially, if you're redeveloping a property, you have to make sure that it's within that same footprint and within the same sort of impact that existed before this ordinance change. And this is where the undeveloped space challenge comes in because undeveloped space is still required to go through that mitigation. In most zones on a 1.5 to 1 ratio. So that means for every cubic foot of undeveloped space lost to development, the property must provide 1.5 cubic feet of compensatory volume within the same floodplain, which is very confusing. But the idea is that if you are removing some sort of function, you're actually, by building a structure, you're making it better. You're doing something to the site to make up for that. The other thing to note here is that there will be new development standards for coastal high hazard flood areas, which are those VE, V zones, and then coastal A zones. So that's a lot of the jetty. In those zones, the requirements are that structures have to be elevated on pilings and columns. So before you could have a sort of basement area that had flood vents. My understanding is in those areas that are subject to velocity waves, that would have to all be elevated outside of that. There's also a new component of it that's called the riparian buffer zone, where the development regulations are quite a bit higher. That's within 170 feet of the edge of the body of water, so the stream. For us, that would be a lot of the marine commercial zone right along the Coquille. So those have higher mitigation ratios. So if you do work there, the amount of mitigation required is double and sometimes triple what the other areas are. I will point out that in the model ordinance, and this is consistent throughout, there are certain activities that would be exempt from these requirements. Those are normal routine maintenance, anything that's sort of like provided the footprint doesn't expand and there isn't any ground disturbance. So people who have buildings in the floodplain can continue to maintain them as long as they're not doing what's called a substantial improvement, which is investing more than 50% of the value of the structure into it. Okay. Next, sorry, this is very confusing. I'm trying to make it as easy to understand as possible. And then there's this permit by permit approach. So it has the same objective as the model code, but what it does is provides a sort of opportunity for us to use reasonable judgment. So the property owner or developer would have to provide what's called a habitat assessment. That would assess or describe the impact of the proposed development on existing habitat and floodplain functions, and then describe the mitigating measures that they're going to use to mitigate that. So, like I said, initially, FEMA required that you have some sort of biologist or what they're calling a qualified professional prepare this document. And they wanted cities and counties to have a requirement that they essentially make a judgment about which of those endangered species that the development would have an impact on. What they've given us new guidance on is that we can make the assumption that all development affects all of the endangered species, which sort of gets rid of the biological part of the report that was really technical and complicated. So they're telling us that they think the regular average citizen could prepare one of these. Having looked at the example they gave me, I'm still a little skeptical. But it is possible. So the property owner would describe the habitat, would describe the loss, and then would prepare a mitigation plan based on a table that's provided by FEMA with those mitigating measures. The document that's submitted to us has to describe how they're going to mitigate it, first by avoidance, then by minimization, then by mitigation. So there has to be some proof that they've tried to make as little impact as possible. Their guidance also says that this path would allow some permits to be issued without habitats, quote, relatively quickly and easily. So that could be a good way to go. This process allows staff to use judgment as long as sufficient detail and analysis are provided to support the proposal. But the big thing to note here is that this is not a long-term solution. So they have notified us that this is really just an interim solution. By 2027, we will probably have to go with a model ordinance or some other path that they create. Okay. Moratorium. I think this one is a little bit obvious, but it essentially buys the city time to find a realistic and practical solution and allow legal issues to play out in jurisdictions that pursue other options. As I mentioned, things are changing rapidly. It may be in the city's best interest to have a moratorium while they come up with whatever the model ordinance or permit by permit process looks like. In particular, in the workshops that I've attended, cities, planners across the state have just echoed the concern that the model ordinance is not clear and objective as it stands right now. And the permit by permit approach is really not there either. FEMA's guidance to us has been that each city or county should modify the model ordinance in a way that is clear and objective to us. However, the legal experts who are on those calls have concerns that this would result in quite a large number of LUBA cases, which cost cities time and money. So just think about that as well. Moratoriums can also have exceptions. So if we wanted to go this route, we can have exceptions again for the routine maintenance, pretty much anything in the list that FEMA provided us that wouldn't require a habitat assessment or doesn't require any sort of mitigation. So that would be nothing that is like a substantial improvement and no ground disturbance. A thing to note about moratoriums is that they're subject to ORS 197.520, which would require we notify DLCD 45 days in advance of the scheduled public hearing, which means no matter what, we're going to default into that permit by permit approach. Moratoriums can remain in place for 120 days before they require an extension, which can be up to 6 months. I think that we are required to have something implemented by June 2025. It has to be actually going. And then we are not stuck though in any of the pick'ems that we choose. We can change really at any time. So if you choose the moratorium to begin with, you can go to a permit by permit or model ordinance route after that. So next slide. Today is a work session, so it's really just an opportunity for you and the public to ask questions, but I do want to let you know that we would recommend defaulting into permit by permit on December 1st, because we wouldn't meet any noticing deadlines for either an ordinance amendment or that moratorium route. But again, allow the exception for routine maintenance once we maybe go a moratorium route. So we could initiate those proceedings initially for 120 days, see where we're at. And then provide an extension if we need to, but again, trying to find a solution by 2025. And I'd like to remind everyone that's here today that we have this item scheduled for action on December 2nd, the City Council's regular meeting at 7 p.m. here. So please let me know if you have any questions. and I will do my best to answer them.
Okay, so Dana,
Yes.
we automatically default to permit, even though we have a meeting on the second. We're already in there on December 1st, correct?
That's right. So every city and county that didn't make a decision and passed something by December 1st, we default. They default
Okay.
to that.
Now, if we went moratorium, we would have to do a hearing.
That's correct.
Could we do a special meeting with a hearing?
My understanding, and I'll let Shayla hop in, is that we have to provide DLCD notice 45 days in advance of that public hearing. So we probably could do it at a special meeting or time it in a way that it just shows up on your February agenda.
Okay, and is there any way that DLCC, I mean, do they automatically approve when you give them the 45-day notice? Or is there communication back and forth for a month or?
I don't think there's communication. My understanding is that ORS has specific findings that the city has to make in order to have a moratorium. We've already looked at it. We would fall under some of those particular points. So we would just say that we're having a moratorium based on the guidance that FEMA's giving us because the laws are changing, notify DLCD, and then have our public hearing. I don't see DLCD telling us we couldn't do it, considering that's the guidance they're giving us.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Fair?
Oh, what is a velocity area? Is that just where the river flows quickly through it or?
So velocity areas are along the ocean front, and they're areas where flooding, I mean, I'm not gonna get this exactly, but where flooding can cause waves to move at a faster rate of speed from the ocean.
Okay,
So velocity, the speed at which those waves and the flooding is coming at an area.
it has nothing to do with the current of the river or,
No, because the velocity areas are mostly along the ocean.
okay.
Yes. But I will, on an FAQ document, I'll put a little more information about what velocity zones are.
All right.
Thank
Okay,
you.
we are going to allow questions from the audience. So
Yeah.
if you just want to come up, we're going to have you come up to the podium
Okay, no problem.
and give your name.
My name's Lynn Ferry. Thank you for allowing this workshop and that. I have the original court documents from this lawsuit between the Audubon Society and 3 other conservative groups that sued FEMA. It was really interesting to see where all the research was all up on the Columbia River, the south, the west side, the middle, all the way up to the Snake River, and included the Snake River and also the Willamette River. They didn't have any document or research in any of the rivers like the Umpqua, Coquille, down here on the Elk and the Sixes, and also the rivers down there in Brookins. Nothing was ever said. And I really wondered, after reading this document and what they wanted to have, they were going to have control over all the rivers. You couldn't do anything to the rivers whatsoever. So I have a real good question. I've been here since '98. I worked with a contractor, worked for a contractor, built the house. I've never seen any flood here since that time. And the other thing that I'm wondering is, okay, we have a dredge that comes in here and it dredges the river. It dredges the river so it drops it down so it helps boats come across the bar. But what it does, it makes easier for the river to be able to flow out to the ocean. Now, in the document that they had, it says you cannot harass, intervene, hunt, fish, do any harm to all these endangered species. And then it also said, and future species that they may say is endangered. So then that means, geez, if the dredge doesn't come up here and all the silt from that water coming down out of the mountain is filling up that river and making it not as deep, you're going to have flooding like you wouldn't believe. And it's going to flood all your water system down there, your storage. It's going to flood all the sewer system that's down there. Then it's going to be a disaster. So I don't know. And with this thing having to be done by the 1st, it was really, I started thinking about it and I says, yeah, I understand. The state of Florida, 94% of the state of Florida is in floodplain. The future president lives in the floodplain. DeSantis is suing the FEMA right now because they were not helping people who voted for Trump or had a sign in front of their building.
Okay, you guys, listen.
So they fired her,
Okay,
you know?
if you've got a
But I think
question,
when he comes into power, he's gonna make this go away.
that's probably true. But let's stick to the questions.
Yeah, let's
Okay,
go political.
thank you very much.
Okay.
Come on up.
And you have somebody in the corner over there on your left.
I am Chuck Hedges. My question
Yes.
is are some of the differences in the definition of the floodplain or the flood zone and a riparian zone?
I can try to answer that. So the special flood hazard area is the map that I showed, those areas that are outlined in blue, and that is what's called the 100-year floodplain. So it has a 1% flooding chance, and that's how the federal government tells us where that floodplain is.
Okay,
They are saying that the riparian buffer zone is 170 feet from any body of water. So it's it's like pretty much the bank of the river. There's that special area along the river and the ocean that are going to be considered riparian buffer zone.
or maybe the mean high tide.
That's right. It's the mean higher high water line.
Okay.
Yes.
So technically then if there are lots, say on the South Jetty that are outside of that buffer zone, they may not be affected by these rules?
They're still affected by the rules. There is an extra level of regulation on that riparian buffer zone, but anything within the floodplain is going to be subject to these rules.
Okay,
So yeah, there's areas that are outside of that riparian buffer zone as defined by that 170 feet are called the RBZ fringe, but they're still part of the floodplain.
okay, I was just trying to think of in cases where, you know, there may or may not be any threatened and endangered species on a particular
Mhm.
parcel.
Yes, and other cities and counties have brought that up with FEMA, that it would be great in the long-term solution to have a process for properties that are pretty far from that RBZ to be able to develop more easily. So it's definitely on our minds.
Good,
But right
Okay.
now, in the interim measure, everything is really being treated similarly.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I think we had somebody in the back first. Come on up.
Don Snyder Smith. Curious, because just off of Face Rock Drive, within the area of that new hotel that was or is still being considered by Bandon, is a riparian waterway. And I'm wondering how that plays into what you're telling us today and possibly into what their plans were or are for that.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great question. And we actually sort of discussed this in our office, that we have a riparian overlay zone that covers all the bodies of water within the city of Bandon, like all the tributaries, Fairy Creek, Geiger Creek. That is different. So that riparian corridor is different than the riparian buffer zone of the NFIP program. And so Gravel Point may have a riparian zone in it, but if it's not part of the identified special flood hazard area, then it's not subject to these code provisions.
So what's being discussed today would not have any overcover with anything off of Face Rock Drive?
That's correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. George?
Yeah, I think Dana might have answered my question. It's going to be Fairy Creek.
Mhm.
This would not affect that 170 foot sort of bothered me.
Yes. Andrea, can you pull up the presentation again, maybe, and go to the map? So Fairy Creek is affected by this. And I think, are you talking about your property
Our
in
property, yes.
particular?
Which
Let's-
is where? On Fairy Creek.
Yeah, I mean, you're still affected. I would have to look, we can we haven't prepared the map yet that would show what's considered that riparian buffer zone with 170 feet from the creek bank, but this one, so, oops, can you go back one? So I'm not sure which one's yours. I can talk to you after this meeting and see if we
Okay.
can figure out if you're in there, but you can see Ferry Creek. There is a pretty wide section of floodplain all along Ferry Creek that would be affected by this ordinance.
How does this correlate with the city's ordinance on the riparian of the wetlands?
So that's there's definitely some overlap. But this one is likely going to be more restrictive. And so the more restrictive in our code always applies.
They've wiped me out.
Well, if you already own a property or if you already have a structure there, you know, and you're not planning on extending it widely, you shouldn't have an issue. You can continue to do routine maintenance. But you probably couldn't be removing trees or expanding the footprint.
I've got trees that are about ready to fall into the creek right now. I
Well,
saw an arborist out
December
looking at
1st
it.
is coming up.
Okay, I carried the FEMA flood insurance for many years.
Mhm.
It got so prohibitive, I've dropped it. I'm sorry for the people with mortgages that have to have it.
Yes, I've heard it's very
But
expensive.
it's unbelievable.
The city is, if we wanted to, the city is able to participate in a program that can provide discounts to that flood insurance, but it requires that we have even higher standards for development in the floodplain. So that's not something that we've considered in a long time. Yes, thank you.
Yes, in the front.
My name is Gary Pinnock. I live down on the jetty on Fourth Street, right next to Redmond Pond. And is that going to be in a part of the affected area?
Yes, definitely.
Yes, it is.
Definitely. Okay, have a couple other questions. When you talk about improvements, does that include improvements inside the house? So if you want to put in a $50,000 kitchen, but not change the footprint of the house, is that going to fall into any of these problems?
Yes and no. So there's a list of activities that FEMA regulates. I'm happy to provide you, and I can put it up on the city's website with certain things that are exempt from that. What they look for when they consider what's called a substantial improvement, and then what's not. I couldn't list them for you today, so I'm just happy to provide that and put it on the city's website. But also, if you're not doing more than 50% of the value of your structure, then it's not considered a substantial improvement and doesn't really trigger these requirements. Also, generally, the only time that we are asking you to provide that information is when if you have to get a building permit, you'd have to get a floodplain development permit from the city, and that's when we would ask you for a list of all the things that you're doing and how much it costs to determine whether or not that meets that 50% threshold.
The other question was maybe.
Can you speak into the
Speak into the-
microphone so it can be?
I'm sorry. The other question was building up. I know there's height limitations there, but there are some single-story houses out there. So people want to put a second story up. Is that going to fall into that category?
It most likely will, so that, I mean, it depends on what the value of the structure is, but if you're having to put a second story on your home, my guess is that it's gonna trigger what's called that substantial improvement. That would mean that like the model ordinance would apply or that habitat assessment would apply.
I'm just curious about that. I'm not
Yeah.
planning on doing that.
It's a really good question.
The other questions I had to do with what are these endangered species? The fish don't come out of the water on the land, of course. So is there something else out there that I should be aware of?
So the species are 17 salmon and steelhead species plus the southern resident killer whale. My understanding is that during flooding events that can affect those fish species, and they could get washed up on land. So I'm trying to say this with a straight face. They, they want the buildings to be fish accessible and egressable. Those are actually definitions in the new model ordinance. That fish could get through them in velocity zones.
Yeah, that's government for you.
Amen.
Yeah,
Federal government.
we are not, this is not,
Yeah.
we're not trying to do this. But thank you, those are really good questions.
So is there going to be any kind of fees that we're gonna have to pay if we don't do anything with our existing homes?
No, so I mean, if you do nothing, then you wouldn't
Fine.
trigger the requirement for a floodplain development permit. Right now, the city's floodplain development permits are free because they're relatively easy for us to review, and we wanted to encourage people to get them. There is a chance with these or with the model ordinance or the permit by permit that we may have to charge a fee to review them because it's going to take a lot more time to make sure you're meeting those standards. But if you're not doing anything, there's no cost.
Okay, just one final question. Is this constitutional? Is it?
This is where I have to tell you, I'm not a lawyer.
Oh, I thought you were the attorney.
No, I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself, but I am the planning director. Our attorney's over here and I'm not sure she wants to weigh in on that question.
No, I just want that, Lynn here was talking about lawsuits against FEMA. And if the city's compliant with what's going on, they may be subject to lawsuits. And it is happening. Supreme Court, of course, is more conservative. And this thing about the Fourth Amendment and the taking of property, they've already decided that when a government agency takes some property like that, through some regulations from a non-elected bureaucrat, that everyone that's involved in it will have to pay for the attorney's fees. And it could be quite expensive. And even the city could end up having to pay into that if it's unconstitutional.
And this is probably not an issue that we're going to discuss today. So
No.
there are probably more people out in the audience that have questions. So we appreciate your questions. Thank you.
Okay, that's all I.
All right,
Thank you. And it is important.
it is.
I'm sure you could.
I have a question via Zoom.
There's a Zoom question, Mary.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I
Yeah.
ask a question?
Yes.
Where do I get the official line that shows where you are in the zone or not? You know, in our property, it's like a squiggly thing going somewhere. So where do I get an official map?
So the city keeps what we call FIRMs, which are flood rate insurance or flood insurance rate maps. We do have those here on file. The best way to view it online is that Coos County hazards map that we've provided a link to on as part of this presentation on the city's website.
Thank you.
The only way to have extremely accurate information is by using a surveyor. Anytime you develop in the floodplain, you are required to get what's called an elevation certificate, and they are able to exactly document where those lines are.
Okay, anybody
Thank
else?
you.
Just have one question.
Let's just see if there's anybody else up here.
This gentleman over here, I think, had his hand up. Did you want to speak?
Fred, do you want to? Yeah, we're gonna have other people speak and then we'll have you.
My name is Fred Granat. I live in Bandon. So what is are we trying to preserve the capability of the banks providing or floodplain insurance? Is that the whole point of this, is to provide floodplain insurance?
No. Are you on?
Is it working now? Okay, there we go. So the point of the city's participation in the National Flood Insurance Program is to be able to provide the flood insurance. My understanding from other cities that have gone down this route, trying to figure out, can we stop participating in NFIP, is that anyone with a mortgage then would lose their mortgage because they are required to have some sort of flood insurance. If you went through a different entity to provide that flood insurance, there are some other companies that do that other than FEMA. They are still required to be ESA compliant, so they would still have to get some sort of take permit from the federal government in order to provide that insurance.
So it is the insurance issue. So what if you just said, if you move to Bannon, you can't buy flood insurance? So if you want to buy something in Bannon, you better have the money.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, that's a political decision, but what
It's not
happens
politi-
to
it's
all the
political
people
here,
who
but-
have mortgages?
But there's a lot of people that don't have mortgages and it's not fair to them.
I would say that's a statement directed towards the city council.
Not today.
Do you see the point of what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, yes, but that would eliminate anyone who couldn't pay full cash price.
How many people here have flood insurance? I mean, that mean is 10, 20, 30, 15? How many guys have? Oh my God, that's good. I didn't know that.
Okay, well.
So that was
probably
my
a lot of
question.
Things we didn't know. Thank you. And
It's not cheap.
it's not cheap.
it's not.
All right,
Sherry, I'd like to hear what
Museum.
you have to say about this FEMA stuff.
going to talk about the museum,
Pardon me?
the museum.
What about museum?
Well, they were-
Hello, Sherry McGrath, Bandon. So thank you, Dana. I think that was really important. We've spent a lot of time looking through all of this as well and talking to all the jurisdictions. Kadra in my office is too shy to talk, but she's actually a fish biologist by trade. And she has done these habitat studies, and after her review of the ever-changing rules, she feels it's above her pay grade. So our concern is if we go to permit by permit, who's doing these reports? And does the jurisdiction feel comfortable reviewing them, right? So there's that part of it too. But one of the things that was enlightening today is I wanted to clarify, Dana, did you say that we have to adopt something permanent by July 2025 or June 2025?
I believe we have to have something in place by June 2025.
Okay, so in other words, this isn't dragging on to 2027 like we originally thought.
Well, so it still does, we have to have something in place by 2025, but these are the pre-implementation
Right.
compliance measures. We'd have to adopt a long-term solution in 2027.
Okay. And then I wanted to clarify something else. Did you say that in December, we're gonna have a new model ordinance draft?
Again, that's the feedback that we've been given, is that they're working on one right now that should meet the clear and objective standard criteria. FEMA is, and they're doing that in partnership with DLCD, but they don't have an exact date when it's going to be available.
Okay, so if we're automatically defaulting on December 1st to permit by permit, is there any reason to make a decision on December 2nd except to initiate a public hearing process?
No, there isn't.
The city council needs to take some action. So what FEMA's told us is that everyone defaults on December 1st, but we have to provide them with information about the direction we're going in, even if we don't, even if all we want to say is we're okay with defaulting to permit by permit and just doing that for 2 years.
And if we change our mind in January or February.
We can do it.
That's correct.
That's also what I wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if we have the option, if we have the option on December 2nd to say, this is what we're doing for now, but we're going to revisit it at the January meeting or the February meeting, that's just as compliant, correct?
That's my understanding is we just have to provide them with the path we're going down, and then that path can change at any time throughout the pre-implementation time
And if
period.
I'm not mistaken, we don't even have to do an official declaration.
No.
We go into default on this second. We don't do anything, and if we change our minds in March, we make a change. We don't have to
That's correct.
declare that we're going to revisit and make a determination at any time other than by July, June,
June.
June.
So.
But we're also trusting them that they're not going to change their mind about us being able to make a decision anytime we
Trusting.
want.
That's correct.
Okay.
Because we've asked that same question about, in particular, the permit by permit route, like
Right.
the guidance has already changed between July and now. And so we just don't know if it's going to continue to change between now and June. So.
Of course it is.
Well, yeah, we know that.
Yes, and we will continue to provide you with that information as we receive it.
Okay. Okay, all right.
Is the council leaning towards doing a moratorium at all?
I don't think we really have got any.
We haven't
opinion
really
at this
discussed,
point.
it. This is the first time we've heard of it.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that the only benefit of a moratorium is to save to mitigate the workload, and also to your point, do we have a determination of, do we have a scope of review of these determinations of, impact studies, environmental impact studies? You're saying that your professional doesn't even seem qualified or doesn't feel qualified to make those determinations, and we don't have the staff to be able to review those determinations. So
Right.
that's the benefit of a moratorium as I see it.
Yeah, I just would hate to see us getting stuck in a moratorium for more than this, 6-month period or 7-month period, whatever it is,
We decide to change it in March, we'll pull the moratorium if we're ready to go, I think.
Yeah, I think it really has to do with your PAPA, right? And, scheduling those meetings. There's going to be a lot of workload that goes into changing the mind as well. So to the comment about having a permit fee for floodplain applications, I think Bandon's been more than generous by having a free review all these years. So I mean, if you have to have a permit application fee to cover costs, that's reasonable. That's part of the cost of development. I would ask kindly that you don't make it $1,500 like Curry County, because that's quite a steep permit fee on top of their already $2,000 permit fee. Just to give you an idea of how much it costs everywhere else, Bandon is very affordable. And also to the point that, city has been generous with the reviews of floodplain applications over the years. And I think working together with keeping it reasonable would be helpful for staying in compliance, but not going overboard. I think that was to Dana's point, is trying to meet the minimum requirements to stay in the program. I did want to say to the comment online, the ferns are also available on the FEMA website. So you can enter in your address and it will pop up with your site specific fern, and you can download it as a PDF if that's helpful for people. I also was wondering about the comment about LUBA. How do you think this is going to be a LUBA issue? Is it because of the clear and objective standard?
Yeah, so if every city takes the model ordinance and modifies it in the way that they think it could be clear and objective, that means every ordinance is then up for LUBA appeal.
Yep.
Okay. Tough decision. I was wondering too about the riparian buffer zone. What about the RBZ that's already been destroyed and there's no more riparian?
The comment that we've gotten from FEMA is it doesn't matter what's happened there. It is in the RBZ fringe, and any future development is then subject to that.
Okay. And then to the comment about dredging, is this affecting dredging, or is that still going to be allowed since that's Army Corps?
Yeah, my understanding is that the Port of Bandon gets a federal permit in order to do dredging. In order to get a federal permit, they do need to be compliant with that Endangered Species Act. So they're getting a take permit as part of that.
Okay.
That's my guess. I think Josh could probably tell me otherwise.
Yeah, I think that was my understanding too, is Josh is on the call. Josh, do you know?
We do receive a federal permit from the Army Corps and other complying agencies in order to do dredging.
Okay, very good. Do we happen to know what the costs of, well, I think this got answered, is that if we're not part of the national insurance program, that private insurance is impossible, if not nearly impossible to get, just to clarify.
I don't think that it's impossible. My understanding is other cities and counties have investigated entities that provide insurance and would provide floodplain insurance, but the problem is they're still subject to Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, which means the same rules apply. They could come at it from a different route, but they ultimately can't affect endangered species.
So you're outside of the program, but you still have to comply with the program as far as the FEMA rules, to clarify.
My understanding, that's what they've said to us, is that those insurance companies would still, in order to provide floodplain insurance, have to get their own take permit from the federal government. And so it's just a roundabout way of doing the exact same thing.
And possibly paying 2 to 4 times as much.
Yeah, I don't know what the cost of insurance would be through another entity.
So I've spoken to several jurisdictions about this problem, obviously, because it's affecting a lot of us. And the majority of them have not made a decision either, and they're defaulting to permit by permit on December 1st to buy some time, if that helps. If we can not make a decision on the second, but maybe put this on a future edition, maybe another work session after we've all had time to digest this information and see what the new model ordinance says in December. I mean, if that would be an option, that's what I'm proposing at this time, and defaulting to permit by permit. And then it's my understanding that anything we submit before December 1st is under current regulation, correct? Yes. Okay, very good. When you were talking about the mitigation piece, like, if you build in a floodplain and then you have to make up for it somewhere else, you said specifically subject property. Maybe it was my misunderstanding. I thought you could also mitigate offsite. Is that not true?
I don't think that we've gotten clear guidance on that yet. There's been some comment about being able to do mitigation banks or something, but when I asked FEMA about that directly, they said that's not part of the pre-implementation compliance measure, but maybe a long-term solution. I'm not sure if you can, like, let's say, build something on one property and mitigate on another. I think we're unclear about whether or not that's possible right now.
Okay. I'm thinking about a few of those properties in the V zone specifically. I mean, those are always difficult to be on, but some of those are multiple tax lots. So it might be possible for somebody to be able to consolidate their tax lots and mitigate on site on another property, I guess is my thought on that, and other areas within our area, community. So anyway, those were my general comments. This is not something that I'm looking forward to doing. And I know that that is 100% the opinion of the city of Bandon and most of the jurisdictions on the Southern Oregon coast. So for those of you in the audience or on Zoom that think that this is local enforced or supported, I don't think that's the case. So looking forward to more conversations on this stimulating topic. And Chris McWhorter is also here, and he has a lot of knowledge about fish habitat studies. He's also a local planner, and I'm encouraging him to speak today as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry.
Okay, what we'd like to do as much as possible is keep it to questions. If you have a question, come on up.
Chris McWhorter, 890 Central. It's in Coos Bay. Yeah, so my question in regards to this is what's the size of the boundary of analysis? Is that limited to the city of Bandon,
Are you talking about for?
the habitat assessment?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the analysis is the project site.
Okay,
That you would have to do the habitat assessment. You'd have to provide an analysis of how the development proposal affects and impacts the critical habitat of the endangered species. So your particular development.
yeah, so I read the FEMA document and then it kind of references like a biological assessment. And biological assessments are typically at the watershed level.
So that's where they changed the guidance between the document that they put out and the
okay.
information they're providing to us. So in the initial assessment, it may have been a larger area. But they said that under the newest guidance, you can assume that all species are affected by development, which sort of nixes the need to do a biological assessment.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes
Yeah,
sense.
so you're just making the assumption that everything's affected, and then you're just working through the avoidance, minimization, and then mitigation
Okay.
as part of that. And I do have an example that FEMA provided us that I can also put on the city's website. I will tell you that they did their math wrong, so don't, if it
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense, it's because it doesn't add up.
Mhm.
But the idea of what we would be looking at for is in that document.
Okay. Yeah, and then so within the FEMA regulations, like I do know noxious weeds, hazard trees, they're already exempt from requiring the floodplain permit. Is your understanding that's continuing or
Yes.
or is that separate? Because this is kind of muddling together pretty quickly.
No, there are a list of exempt activities, and my understanding is that the removal of noxious vegetation is still exempt from floodplain standards. So, I think the way that the guidance reads is that it says if you're doing anything to make that riparian area better and more functional, you're allowed to do that.
Yep. Oh, okay.
So yeah, if you're getting rid of noxious vegetation, totally fine.
And my only other point for council is, So the way these floodplain programs work is this is something the city takes on with FEMA. That's you guys. The LCD really doesn't need to tell you how to do this. So I wouldn't go down the direction assuming you needed a lot of, you know, the state has tendency to kind of state that, you know, needs to be a lot of expert professionals involved. And that's not the case on the floodplain. It's really it's what the local jurisdiction feels comfortable with accepting. So that could be your professional planners, that's you know, assuming this too, you know, making the reviews, not, doesn't need to be like dragging in outside professionals. Other than engineering, if, you know, don't go sideways. So engineering, you know, if you're in the zone and you gotta have an engineer sign off or a surveyor, that's separate. But in regards to this stuff, there isn't actually dedicated guidance that this needs to be done by a biologist or anything like that, so. But you do gotta justify this to FEMA, so that's not really much of an answer, but it's kind of a comment though, so.
And you're a planner with what city?
I work with Sherry off and on, but I work for myself. So,
Okay,
Yep,
thank you.
yep, so.
Thanks.
And if I could just comment on that, the professional statement, we did ask FEMA specifically about that. I'm just looking for it in here. One of the things that we asked them was, what is a qualified professional? Because in their model ordinance, it says an appropriate subject matter expert that is defined by the community, which is really, really vague. Because I said, who can do these habitat assessments? They seem a little bit complicated. And they said a qualified professional. And we said, well, what does that mean? They were hesitant to require that cities define that because it could be different in every community. You may have someone like a planner who just happens to have the breadth of knowledge required to prepare this type of document. They did suggest that surveyors or people who do wetlands delineations may also be considered a qualified professional. So that's something to think about, that if the city wanted to define that, we could, but we really don't have to. We can use that really broad, bizarre definition.
Dana, one more question. If there's a permit on a property that's in the zone right now in the city abandoned and it's in the approval process, but they're not going to break ground till next year, are they excluded from this, or they're going to have to be included?
So if they have already gotten approval, then that means they're subject to the rules that were in place at the time they applied. And that's everywhere. So if they have already been approved, then they will not be subject to the changes that happen on December 1st.
Even if they haven't broken ground yet?
That's correct.
Thank you.
As long as the permit doesn't expire.
Right.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Yes. Oh, Henry. Okay.
How long does it take to get the permit process going? Because
Great question.
my neighbor and I have property down in the jetty that's for sale. So if we decide to get a permit and we have the blueprints and everything for the building, how long does it take to have that process?
So you only need to submit the permit, but before December 1st. So you don't have to be approved.
But how long does it take to get the permit?
That is a difficult question to answer until we've reviewed your application, because I can't tell you that we can approve it quickly until I know what it is you're applying for and if you meet the city's
You're gonna
minimum
have to hire a
requirements.
bunch of people.
Are you talking about the permit by permit approach?
Yeah.
So I think if we went that route, that is something that we would have to talk about internally and with the city council is whether or not we have the staffing resources to be able to review those permits, or if we'd have to go with an outside agency to assist us.
And the other question that I have is, they're talking about fish being stranded and dying. Well, what's FEMA gonna do about the Coquille Valley that floods every winter? And it's all a lake, and then it dries up during the summer. Are they gonna keep the farmers from having their cattle out there or putting up their hay bales to be for sale? And even the marsh over here is flooded over all the time. Fish get caught in that.
Yeah, these are not really questions that I can answer
Yeah,
for you
I know.
outside of
It's
the
just-
city abandoned, but I think those are good questions to be
Yeah,
asked.
it's just kind of a joke about the whole thing, you know?
Unfortunately, it's not funny, but
No, it's not.
anybody else? Henry?
Henry Schleipel, Bandon. I want to make a comment. I don't have any question.
All right.
And the comment is this. when that door opened this afternoon to have this meeting, the value of our property plummet. We won't be able to get a dog catcher to buy our property down there. And that's what this meeting has done. And, you know, we're being force fed by the federal government. Then the other complaint that I have is the fact that we were notified this month of this meeting. This should be the first meeting, not the last meeting. This should have started months ago for comments. And I know that you folks never had any control over that, but it makes me feel like I'm back in Russia.
I mean,
the
only way that I can respond to you is that FEMA notified us, but they didn't provide any guidance to us. We've been attending workshops to understand this, to be able to provide this information to you up until last week. So, I mean, I feel in the same boat as you that this is really being pushed on us and we're not really being provided enough information to really properly communicate with our citizenry. So I am really sorry that this has happened as quickly as it has and that we haven't been able to have these meetings earlier.
I don't see you folks as being to blame. You know, it's the way the federal government is force feeding us. And, and we have to just swallow it. And that's wrong.
You might take it up with people like Merkley, your congressman. Maybe they're the ones that need to hear some of these complaints.
It's too late. You know, this decision has been made and we're being force fed and we're going to have 3 options. None of them are any good. None of them would fit us down here on the jetty.
It's true.
And we can't sell a property to a dog catcher now. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you.
All right, does anyone else have anything to say? Yes.
Quick question, what Jim said.
You got to get up here. I know you're having trouble, but.
This has to do with what Henry was just saying in property values. I also own property down there. And if the property values go down, do our taxes go down?
No.
No, because you're taxed on assessed value, not market value. Your market value will go down, but probably not your assessed value.
Your assessed value is based on the market value, and he takes
Well,
it from there.
Not really.
To take that
It's-
up.
it's-
We don't have any control.
Okay, I don't want to argue with you.
Oh, I mean, it's,
I know better. I know what taxes are.
Okay, so as far as the decision today, we're just
We're
going
not-
to,
We don't have to make one.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
We're
no
just going to go into a default and reevaluate
Well-
the moratorium as things come.
We decide that on December 2nd.
okay.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right, if we have no more questions, we'll adjourn. Thank you. And I appreciate Dana and all that she's done to bring this to the community. And I appreciate the fact that you guys have come to hear, because too often we don't have a newspaper. Too often it's hard to get this kind of information out to people. And I think she's done an excellent job of putting this presentation together and allowing, because usually at workshops, we don't allow people to talk. Here we've allowed everybody to talk. So I think we've gone as far as we can, and we're just as confused as the public. So we appreciate your coming.
Hey, Peter.
What?
Hot water.